welcome back to another episode of the Young Professionals Podcast. Sarge, who are we talking to today?
Today we have Aidan Slack. Aidan Slack is a management consultant at the Boston Consulting Group, where he's been working nearly 2 years after completing his undergraduate degree at Monash University. Aidan was a member of the first cohort to complete a Bachelor of Science Advanced Global Challenges at Monash University, a course with under 30 students and a strong focus on networking and mentoring. During his undergraduate degree, Aidan completed multiple internships, both domestically and abroad, which gave him invaluable early exposure to different people and industries in the corporate world. Aidan was a member of 180 Degrees Consulting and landed a vacation role at Deloitte in his final year of study. Aidan turned a second vacation role at a boutique consultancy into part-time work during his honours year of uni before taking a well-earned gap year to travel the world before starting at BCG. Aidan, welcome to the show, mate.
Thanks very much for having me, guys.
So, you started your journey at Monash University doing a Bachelor of Science Advanced Global Challenges. That was a brand new course. What drove you to jump into that, and what did that actually entail?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful, the name of that course, but the easy way to summarize it is a science course that was probably looking more generally away from just pure science and research and sort of setting up individuals for science communication, science leadership, the sort of problem-solving aspects that you get from science and combining it with the real world. So for me personally, it seemed like a great way to break out of the science mold, but yet still enjoy the rigor and analysis that you get with the science study. I'd always enjoyed science through school, so it was definitely on my horizon. And then I was just thinking about, well, what practically do I want out of it long term? And for me, the intersection between like science communication, and science and business sort of was all in that one course. And of course, there was ambiguity with the whole thing, which in a way was actually more attractive because being the first cohort, there's going to be kinks, there's going to be things to iron out, which makes it a little bit more interesting.
Unreal. And in that, there was a large focus or a big focus on networking. I remember when we've spoken previously, you spoke about how a lot of your first year was built around networking and meeting different people. How did that all go, and what did you learn from that first year?
Yeah, I'll take a bit of a step back and give you some more context on the course, because I think that's where the focus on networking all starts. So the idea of the course was that you do your basic science units that you would normally do, but you also have one unit that's the Global Challenges unit. And for those ones, we would have a strong focus on just thinking about the real world and the applications for science. So every fortnight, we actually had guest speakers coming in to talk to us, which I thought was like an incredible opportunity to hear from people that had done something in their career already, were thought leaders in certain spaces. So there was that aspect already that was, in a way, maybe networking, but the takeaway was more about the exposure that you get from it. And then alongside, there was an expectation in first year that we would find a mentor. I know the word mentor is quite loaded and there's many different understandings of what exactly a mentor is. But it was basically just an exercise where you'd have to go out, chat to someone, see if you like them, go along with them, and then you sort of went from there.
And how did you go about finding your mentor?
It's a tricky one. There's a lot of head scratching going on. It's like, is this like a cold calling exercise? Is this? But I decided to sort of just use a natural progression of things. So I was helping out with the open day for Monash University. So was looking to help the faculty, obviously talking about a new course. They wanted some students there. And they also had a few alumni that were floating around as well. So you can't talk to students all day. So I made the most of the opportunity to talk to some of the alumni. And it was pretty much a conversation that was had with someone that was also there, the open day from Monash University pharmacology faculty. And then I was thinking about chemistry at that stage. So actually I had a very fascinating conversation with the person. And to be honest, one thing led to another. It wasn't ever in my mind, all right, let's find a mentor, but more like, let's chat to this group of people. They're quite interesting.
Yeah, cool. And with that, Slacky, like I think mentoring is something that a lot of people start talking about or hearing about when they're already in industry a lot of the time rather. But I think it's a great thing that there was that push to think about getting a mentor or go out and explore that at such a young age. Like, is that something that you think has benefited you once you are in the corporate space already? Like, you're already thinking about, hey, what can I learn from these people in like a non-greasy way? Has it shown you what those kind of relationships can be like now that you're a couple of years into your role?
Yeah, I definitely think that like the early exposure just makes you start thinking about it earlier. So even if it's not a conscious development of how mentorship works or is managed, it just puts it on your horizon, which I thought was quite the valuable step for me. And it sort of just breaks down those barriers and sort of what your own perception of a mentor is. I think you sort of build it out quite personally about how you want to engage in a mentor relationship, how you want to work with someone. And so then when you're actually in the approach, when you're in sort of your corporate career and then you're thinking about mentors, it's less about the mentor and more about there's this person at work that I want to engage with because I can learn a lot from them. And there's sort of less stigma associated with, right, this person's going to be my mentor, and more of like a development of like a common relationship and interest, and then advice comes from that.
Mm.
And what did that mentor relationship look like? Do you set dates as like, oh, we catch up like once a fortnight or once a month, or is it a bit more you kind of just reach out when you needed or wanted to have a chat? Like,
yeah, and I think it depends on circumstance, obviously, but I think initially it is like you put in time for let's have a chat, say every couple of months or at a turning point where you're unsure about something or other, and just so you're sort of regularly touching base, because it's quite easy to fall off sort of that common sort of cycle of engagement, but at the same time, like, they're a professional and you're a student, like touching base with them too often probably not in their interest either. So it's like, don't annoy them, weird, but also don't get forgotten. Like,
yeah. No, I think that's good advice. And I think we're going to be keen to kind of jump around to different points during the chat, but I think it would be interesting for people listening to understand what you do day to day now that you're in industry. So you're a management consultant at Boston Consulting Group, or BCG, people might know it as. Why don't you kind of run us through what your day to day is and what a management consultant is?
Yeah, sure. The one that always gets told by management consultants is that no day ever looks the same and like everyone's different. But actually, I was having a conversation with my neighbour who's in the medical field, and she got quite annoyed by that response, and so I've had to adjust it accordingly. But it's a good analogy actually of using medicine. Management consultants, in my mind, are problem solvers for businesses, the same way a doctor is a problem solver for someone's medical condition that they come forward with. So businesses have problems whether they're not growing at a fast enough rate, they're hemorrhaging money, different sort of situations like that. They want to grow into a new market. They've got two products. How do they choose between each one? There can be some very interesting problems that businesses have. Others, they just don't have the capacity to do themselves. So when they don't have the capacity to do it, when they don't have the expertise to do it, then the management consultants sort of have their little niche within the business world to come in and actually say, all right, how can we approach this problem? How can we structure it? Let's have a dedicated team working for X amount of time, and let's ensure that we have a solution to give the business.
How did you come to want to be a doctor for businesses?
That's a good tagline.
Doctor for businesses. Is that what's going on the podcast title, is it?
I could be. It's definitely on the short list. There you go.
Just writing them as we go. It's a good one. I think problem solving is probably the crux of it. Indecision, probably a close runner up. Didn't quite know what I wanted to do, but consulting by nature is very general. Gives me exposure to multiple different industries, doing multiple different types of work. And so the logic was, well, if I start with consulting, maybe after a few years I might know what I want to do. The jury is still out, but that's beside the point. I think it's still interesting and still pretty engaging as a day-to-day kind of job.
It's like you mentioned there that getting into consulting gives you a broad array of experiences and insights into different businesses. And in our kind of chat before today, you mentioned that a lot of the internships that you had through your undergrad gave you a similar exposure to businesses and people, both domestically and around Australia. Do you want to speak to the importance of those internships in your perspective before you got into the corporate world for real?
Yeah, definitely. Internships are just a way to expose yourself. And as you said, it's getting yourself out there. It's building your own knowledge. Like university is great for learning sort of the coursework and sort of having a great time with new friends and everything that goes with that. But actually sort of putting it into practice is where the internships come in my mind. So doing an internship exposed me to A, how the corporate world works, but also B, how the corporate world talks. Mm-hmm. I think there's certainly like a language of business and ways in which people engage with one another that is best learnt through osmosis and just seeing what is out there in the world, and sort of how you fit and play within that dynamic. Just the way as you have a dynamic with a friendship group, you have a dynamic with a business, an organization or a company. And so getting out and just exposing yourself to that is definitely something that I took away from those internships. And I guess also the bottom line is it shows that you're proactive. Like if you're growing towards a job at the end of university, it shows that you're taking steps to actually get somewhere and get something out of it.
Slacky, you're when we chatted before the show, you spoke about how your approach to going into a professional environment was that you saw it as a fantastic opportunity to meet people and learn about working with different people. I think that's a great view and a bit different from others, because I think people tend to focus a little bit more on the badge of where they are as opposed to what's going on. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think that work is based around people, and we often forget the fact that businesses rely on people, irrespective of your knowledge on finance or commerce or science or whatever it may be. You're fundamentally going to be working with other people, and I think that's what it boils down to. And for me, it's that engagement that you have with everyone else that A, makes work worthwhile. To have friends at work, to engage with people and to get along with them, it makes the day-to-day so much better. But also you start to understand what people are interested in, what they're after. And from a consulting perspective, you're not just solving a problem, you're solving a situation. You want to make sure that people, the client, is comfortable with what you're doing, they're engaged with what you're doing, and sort of they're picking up what you're putting down. If you just run off in a little silo and just do your own thing, then the whole point of consulting is somewhat ruined.
For someone that is interested in getting into consulting or any area that the role title of consultant would be something that is in that business, and let's just assume that they're either in high school or first or second year uni, what would be a bit of advice that you give to someone like that to try and get their foot in the door somewhere? Like if their course isn't maybe as focused on internships as say yours was, what would be a good first step to get that foot in the door and have that first bit of exposure to what working in an environment like that is actually like?
I'll start by saying that I actually wasn't interested in consulting initially. I think it was something that I sort of fell into and sort of explored just by the fact that I was doing different internships. I don't think I was doing internships initially to work out how to get into consulting. I think it was more of I need to suss out the business world before it was a step that I wanted them to know who I was. So it's like an interview, I guess. It's not just, you're not just being the one interviewed, you're also interviewing the company to be like, is this the company I want to work for? And for me, it was sort of the same thing. It's like, is this an industry I'm interested in? So that's sort of like why I jumped around a little bit, tried some different things, did an internship with a social enterprise, sort of understand, how they had changed, what were their ambitions, their goals, did one with a pharmaceutical company because, hey, I was a science student, like it made sense to sort of go into that area. And it was actually that internship that started the thought process about consulting, because what I was doing was essentially assessing a market for a new drug, which when you say it in isolation like that, could very easily read as a brief from a consulting project. And it was the person that I was working under that said, if you're interested in this, have you ever thought about consulting? And at that point in time, the short answer was definitely no. But it just sort of got that ball rolling a little bit, sort of ticking along in the background and be like, hey, these are some different options that I could consider, and started the narrowing down process of what I want to do after uni, because that's always an ambiguous and challenging question.
You spoke a bit about jumping around between interests and trying different things. Did you ever get any feedback or like flack when you'd apply for things as to like, oh, you don't know what you want to do, therefore maybe we're not interested in you?
The point that you make's a good one, that in some cases it can be seen as a disadvantage, but I believe that you can tell a narrative about why you were doing it. It's just as important as the fact that you jumped around and you did different things. So the narrative explains your personality, where you're coming from. And I think they're not really too bothered as long as you can have a good argument saying what you're doing and why you're driven, and also why you wanted to be an internship at that place. You could be, you've had this massive revelation that you've never wanted to do that again, what you've done previously, and you want to try something else. And if you have a reason for why you want to try what you're currently applying for, it all makes sense. Like I have plenty of friends who are now in working in law, who at one point were thinking about the consulting idea, and so they did a few internships there. And I don't think when they applied to a law firm, the law firm's like, you've got consulting here, that means you're not committed to law. They've probably mounted a pretty good argument that they liked law at the time, and they still do.
I think too, that's lucky. I'm a lawyer at the moment. I hope you don't have any hard feelings against me for that.
No consulting background.
No consulting background. But particularly, like I can speak to, say, coming through the clerkship program and the graduate program, and people were often concerned that like, oh, I've got this kind of a job that doesn't really suit law, for example, and this is just an example pathway. But once being in industry for a while, you realize that, and this is more talking to students at university now, that, if you've got a small business that you're running, or you're working as a manager at a cafe, or you're doing X, Y, and Z that you don't necessarily think links directly to where you're trying to get to your point, there's definitely a narrative that you can draw out of those experiences. Even if it's, volunteering at the local footy club or whatever you're doing, I think it's an important point that people should take on board, in that you can develop skills at different roles that are not directly linked to what you want to do, but you can tell that story. And that's the most important part when you're talking to a prospective employer.
It speaks to personal knowledge about where you are in your life and where you want to go to, I think, as well. So if you can tell a very clear and concise story of why you are where you are and why you want to go where you want to go, then it's so much more compelling. And for a bit of a side on consulting, I don't think having a varied background is a downside at all. If anything, some companies look to that as a massive upside, because it shows that you've been exposed to different things in the world. You think a little bit differently, because realistically, if you're solving a problem for a client, they want you to come at it from a unique perspective. If they could do it themselves, then why would you be there in the first place? So a lot of my colleagues now come from very, very background. So you have your classic commerce background. There's quite a lot of engineers as well. There's definitely a few science students. There's doctors, professional musicians, people that have done liberal arts degrees. It's sort of really a jack of all trades. And the one bit that sort of connects all those different people together is that they're smart, they're driven, and they sort of want to solve problems. And that's exactly what we're there to do in those companies.
I think that's great. And to get to a bit more of a specific about how people could get into kind of a place like BCG. And I think if we put anything like that in the show notes for university students studying, say, management or wanting to get into that field, the thought of getting into BCG is probably a big driver, and that seems to be a special place to be. So from a practical standpoint, what did that recruitment process look like? And when did you start getting serious about applications? How'd you go about that? Were you reaching out to people in the business before you made your application, things like that? Why don't you step us through that process?
Yeah, it's a very daunting process. I know for many students that are going through it, I found it hugely intimidating, deciding where I wanted to apply, what I wanted to apply. There's so many different things that sort of have to go under the bridge before you actually make that decision. But I'll take a bit of a step back and link it to what we talked about in terms of networking. One of the factors for me was my involvement in 180 Degrees Consulting, student-run organisation where it basically gave you a bit of exposure to consulting and you helped out certain organisations within society to give them pro bono support.
Is that through uni, or where did you get involved with that?
Yeah, so that was through university, through the case competitions that they often run. A few friends decided we wanted to give it a go. And then afterwards I decided, hey, let's get involved with this. It looks pretty cool. It's not something I know much about. So it's a good opportunity to learn something. And if I am thinking about consulting, it does seem like a logical trial ground, really. And the people I met in that were fantastic. And that's sort of where my journey to actually the applications began. It maybe just speaks to how proactive I am or not, in that I once had a conversation with a couple of people that are thinking about applying to McKinsey, Bain and BCG, the sort of the three management consulting firms that are seen as the ones to apply to. And at this point in time, I didn't really know much about any of those three companies, and also didn't really know the deadlines that they were talking about either. So it was a bit of a wake-up call, and they sort of dragged me along with them. So huge credit to those guys for helping me get to where I am, because we sat down on weekends and started preparing for the interview, because it is quite a unique style of interview for consulting. And yeah, I was fortunate enough to work with them for a fair bit, and then to actually get the interview and put what we'd practiced into an actual interview.
And you spoke about how daunting the interviews are, and my understanding is that they're case study style interviews. How does that go? And how do you prepare?
Yeah, the case study interview for consulting does have a pretty bad reputation.
Plenty of YouTube videos around about how to prepare for them.
You can watch many YouTube videos on how to prep. And a lot of them do focus on the case study interview. And that would probably be my first point of advice, is that there's two aspects to an interview. There's the get to know you bit at the start, where they're looking at your resume, they're looking at who you are as a person. And then there's a case study interview. So if you focus all your attention on the second one, you sort of miss the first one. And that first get to know you section sets the tone for the case study. If you haven't established some rapport or any level of engagement with your interviewer, you're going to feel like it's an interview rather than a conversation. And what you hear from all those YouTube videos, I'm sure, is that the really good case studies are more like conversations. So what will happen is they'll present you a case study, which is in effect a small scale example of a case that they've worked on themselves normally. So a business is looking to expand into an overseas market, and they'll give you a blurb and they say, well, what do you think? And so you sort of have to structure your thoughts around how would you solve this problem. Then they'll feed you some data, maybe it might be a graph, and they say do some maths. And this is the bit that I think gives people nightmares. The idea of doing maths in front of someone else for a job is just harrowing.
I really hope that they actually said, now do some maths. Is that a direct quote?
Run the numbers. I can't remember what the actual actual words were, I think it's more softly framed around, is there any insights you can get from this data? Because consulting's all about insights. But it is one of those experiences where you just need to practice talking out loud with your maths, because maths is not one of those things that people feel comfortable with unless you're an absolute wizard, which I definitely do not fall into that category. So that's the one aspect that I think gets the worst rap. But once you're sort of through that, you're actually really discussing a very interesting business case. I still remember my interviews and the questions that I got and the problems that I was trying to solve, because they were actually generally quite engaging. And it's a pretty good tell for maybe I'm in the right area and maybe I'm going for the job that actually I will be interested in.
So on the whole, you enjoyed the interview process?
Maybe I'm a sucker for punishment, but I didn't think they were too bad, yeah.
Probably put you into that bucket. Slacky, you said, and your point about the interview process and there being two sections, and like the first is the rapport building, then the second is the technical bit. The developing the rapport part came up in our chat before the interview, and you had a good story about a networking night where you met someone and you developed rapport, and that ended up being a good thing for you. Can you step us through that and how that goes to your point about networking being organic and being real?
For sure. For me, networking it's a loaded word that has many associations with it, but I think it is more just getting to know someone and actually engaging with them and learning what makes them tick. I think there's some interesting advice that people give around you need to be interested to be interesting and all those different ones. Not sure if I got that the right way around or not.
We'll go with it.
I think that's fine.
Yeah, we'll work with that one. But if you can actually have an engaging conversation with someone, and this is something you can learn through those internships, because it is a slightly different engagement when you're working with someone who's in the business world, because they have a different perspective on it. And if you can actually have a good chat with them about what they're doing day to day, listen to what they have to say, listen to understand, because then you can ask very interesting questions to them rather than sort of just listen to say your story, which you can sort of see some people in those networking kind of events just be ready to sort of give you their resume. You ask them a few questions and they'll tell you the entirety about your life. And the experiences that you mentioned there, Marriott, around how I sort of engage with BCG is that I was having this conversation with someone who'd been working there for a little while, and we were just chatting about how he was going in Melbourne. He'd just moved to Melbourne from New Zealand. And sort of getting to know the city. Of course, as a Kiwi, he had to talk about the rugby, and I had to engage with him on that front as well. And we sort of been chatting about half an hour or so, and then he turned around to me and said, "This is a networking event, but you haven't asked me anything about consulting or my job really. Like, is there any questions that I can help you with?" And it sort of made me take a step back a little bit and think, I found out more from that company from chatting to someone there and sort of seeing who they were as a person than I actually did from like asking them very direct questions about what business do you do? Like, what's your average day look like? Because for me, I wanted to work in a place where I go along with the people. And I think that's consulting's biggest draw card, in that the people are very interesting. They've all got amazing backstories, all highly intimidating individuals.
Yourself included.
Yeah. So yeah, that's where I like to be the exception. It's always good to be the exception in a crowd. I think I'm there for amusement for the rest of them.
Ever the contrarian.
Before the show, we're talking about like next steps and other interests, and one of the things that came up was potentially doing an MBA. Why does that interest you, and what do you think that path might look like?
It interests me. It also intimidates me. I think
why does it intimidate you too?
It's a challenge, and that's probably the underlying reason for me doing a lot of the things that I do. Like it feels slightly uncomfortable, and so therefore I want to give it a go. Like an MBA at an overseas university is something that's sort of not quite within the realms of comfort. Like it will involve moving, involve studying the new topic area. There's a challenge associated with that, which for me is like a bit of a red flag to a bull.
Probably a period of quarantine as well.
Yeah. So 14 days to myself might be a good thing. And I think, an MBA for me, coming from a science background, actually makes a bit of sense. It sort of rounds out my understanding from a theoretical perspective. Sure, I understand business relatively well. Some would say, some would disagree. From my time at BCG, but actually having an MBA sort of means that you can be like, I've studied the financial concepts or whatever they may be, and actually know them in a bit of detail.
Just for people listening who might be a little bit younger than, say, university at high school, can you just step out what an MBA is and where that would be useful and why people would do that, say, after they've been in industry for a little while?
Definitely. So an MBA, Masters of Business, is Masters of Business Administration. Sorry, I've just had an acronym and I haven't even bothered to use all three of the letters. That's what consulting does to you.
You're too efficient, mate.
I don't speak in full sentences anymore. I'm sure you've noticed that one as well. Masters of Business Administration is normally looked to as a degree to help you up the management levels. It thinks about leadership, how to organize companies, how to organize your strategy going forward. And so that's normally why it's seen as something that you've done after a few years in business. You've sort of had a little of a feel around of how businesses work and how you sort of engage with them. But then sort of the MBA purpose is to take that one level up and start thinking, well, how would you lead an organization? How would you have influence over where you go as a company, what decisions that you make? And so it's seen a little bit as the next step. But that said, there's many other different pathways that people take, and an MBA can be seen as a little bit old school.
You spoke before, just to go back to science and working in a business environment. Science, like how do you apply what you learned in your science degree in a management consulting space?
Management consultants actually really enjoy having scientists and engineers because science is very problem-solving heavy. You're presented with something that doesn't work or you want to make it work. And for me in chemistry, it was, say, synthesis of a compound. You wanted to get compound X, say. So you had a hypothesis of how you're going to get there. You're going to do 8 steps in this order, and you test it step 4, test it step 6, try again if it didn't work out. And in a way, consulting can be quite similar to that. I talked about why businesses have those problems. And the approach that consultants take is they normally have a hypothesis of what the problem is. You're not just blindly sort of rummaging through data, although sometimes it might feel like you are. But you try and have a purpose to it. You have an hypothesis that the problem with this company at the moment is they're underutilizing the market, some business jargon insert here. And then you go about trying to prove that. And in science, that's exactly what we're sort of doing day to day. So that sort of intellectual curiosity and problem solving that I got from science is what I use in consulting.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And it goes to the broader learning, I think, more generally, that you can apply like one skill set across heaps of different fields that you might learn at uni or part-time jobs when you're at high school, or even part-time jobs at university. And then even after you finish your degree, you're obviously learning things in management and consulting that tomorrow if you turn around and say, I want to go and be a whatever it might be, there's certainly going to be skills that you've learned in that role that you can apply elsewhere. So I think it's a really good point to take away. Slacky, just before we wrap up, just a couple of I guess, more obscure questions for you that people might find a bit interesting. What would you think, or what would you say rather, has been one or two failures that you've learnt from over your journey from, say, high school to now? And the reason why we ask is that we always hear of people's success stories, and that's fantastic. But I think it's important to hear that people can muck up and make bad decisions or poor decisions, and then really learn from them. And it's okay to do that because everyone does that. So just interested to hear if the great man has made any mistakes along the way.
You're blowing smoke up my ass now. I feel like you're preparing me for an interview with that question. It's definitely one that gets trotted out on the interview circuit, but it is a good one because it means, reflect a little bit on what you've done. And there's definitely plenty of failures along the way, that you can always positively look at them as learning opportunities, not failures.
Very management consultant of you.
Exactly. Insert synonym here. For me, I think definitely some people view failures as throwing in an application to a company and just not getting any response back from it. It can be very disheartening, don't get me wrong, but I think everyone's gone through it. If you want to sort of find a job at a company, be prepared to apply to many different companies. That's not going to be sort of the silver bullet. You apply to one, it'll be the sort of the one be all and end all. But sort of taking a different approach for your question around failure, because we so often think about it in the corporate sense of like business, or whether it be sport or all those kind of situations. But I think one that speaks quite well to my approach and it being all about personalities and different people is that, and this is a very Melbourne story because it starts with me drinking coffee. As any good Melbourne story, I was drinking a coffee, standing around with a group of, so a failure that I found quite interesting and slightly novel was when I was actually working at my current job as an associate at BCG. And I was having a cup of coffee, standing around in a group of my colleagues. There was a few senior partners there, and I was actually having a chat with one of the senior partners. It was a very relaxed sort of setting. We're all waiting for our coffees in the morning. How else do you start your day? And as the good associate, I was making conversation, laughing along at what the partner was saying. And I choked while laughing. I thought I was able to drink, and then he made a comment, and my instinctive response to an associate was to laugh, forgetting that I was drinking. And I choked and just sprayed coffee everywhere.
Oh, no.
And so that was the day that I painted a senior partner with coffee all over his work shirt. And I swear my career was over. I thought I was absolutely done. And looking around at the faces, I think everyone else had that exact same thought as well. We've just seen the last of him.
You can stay here, mate.
Yeah, bizarre. But the partner found it so hilarious. He was laughing about it. And it just sort of goes to show that the human element of work and of engaging with people is sort of sometimes forgotten about. People in these companies, they're people too. It goes without saying, but if you just treat them like people and just engage with them and sort of maybe find other ways to break the ice rather than what I did. But I still have a very strong relationship.
Bring a spare shirt with you before you proceed with that. With that line.
Make sure they're wearing a rain jacket.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I still get along really well with that senior partner. He pays me out on it for sure. Like, I think it's very justified. But
absolutely.
Yeah. The human side of just being a real person, I think, goes a long way. And we can feel like being robots when it comes to sort of these engagements that we have with companies. And maybe that's a takeaway from all those different internships, is that you got to bring yourself. You can strip away what you think you're meant to say and sort of the corporate jargon and nonsense, and actually just be a real person, ask them how they're going, all those kind of things, rather than what you think you should say, because inevitably you'll say the wrong thing.
And with that, Slacky, just the last one. What advice would you have to your younger self other than not spitting coffee all over your senior partner?
Oh, what do you mean? I think it works perfectly. I think it's a great tactic.
Maybe we recommend that in the show notes.
Yeah, it's like how to spit coffee on someone and still be an associate at BCG. Maybe that's the play. We'll start a new trend. Advice is a difficult one because everyone's gone through a different journey. For me, it's putting yourself out there. We think about skill building a lot. It's like, how do you build your prowess at Excel or modeling or whatever it may be, but got to spare some time to build up your comfort levels, and I wouldn't say skills, but more just familiarity with talking to new people, engaging with people that you haven't engaged with before, and not just sitting there in like stunned, awkward silence. It's definitely like a bit of an art form to sort of be relaxed and just chat with people, because you're used to doing it with your friends that you know very well. But in the business sense, you don't know these people well, and all of a sudden you're in a meeting room with them and you're going to have to chat with them. So learn how to chat with people.
Do you have any tips or tricks, or like what's your mindset in terms of being in that meeting room or being out on the street, say, and speaking to someone you don't know?
Probably that no one knows what they're doing or where they are in the world. So if you just realize that the person next to you is exactly the same as you and probably doesn't have too many ideas of what they want to, or where they want to do it, or who you are even, I think it sort of makes you realize that the person that you're talking to is just as human as you are. And they're probably going through the same doubts and concerns of being stuck in a room with this random person. So just cross that barrier, make it easier for them.
Embrace it.
Exactly.
The part that I hope people take out of that is just to, as you said, take that first step forward and lean into it and just go and talk to someone that you haven't spoken to before, because that is going to be the rest of your life, irrespective of what industry you go into. And it's a super important skill to get better at. And there's only one way to do that. But Slacky, thank you very much for your time, mate. I think people are going to get a lot of good little tips and nuggets of information out of that. And they certainly know that the best way to become an associate at BCG is to spit coffee over the most senior partner they can find.
Yeah, exactly. It's been great chatting with you guys. I hope some of those points were constructive. I know some of them probably weren't, but hopefully there's some little nuggets in there for you.
Beautiful.
That's
All right,
awesome.
mate. Well, thanks very much.